Welcome to Who Shaves the Barber, a weekly podcast where we explore paradoxes, thought experiments, and other pointless problems. I'm William Nava. Today we're going to talk about Saul Kripke's book, Naming and Necessity. Before I start on the book, a couple words about Saul Kripke. Saul Kripke is awesome. This book, Naming and Necessity, is one of maybe 4 times that he completely revolutionized something major in contemporary philosophy. Okay, so he is a major developer of modal logic. So modal logic is a logic that makes use of ideas of possibility and necessity. And Kripke created the semantic interpretation of modal logics that essentially made it extremely useful to use in philosophy, and now it's just a tool that's used in pretty much every area of philosophy. Kripke also has a really interesting book about a rule-following paradox in Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations, which is actually a really interesting and fundamental topic that I'll do a different episode on. And he also has a paper in which he proposes a radically new, for the time, solution to the liar paradox, which is now one of the major solutions to the paradox, and I'll definitely do an episode on that as well. But actually, what he does in Naming and Necessity is probably the most influential and important work that he's ever done. It completely revolutionized philosophy in general when it first came out. I think it's safe to say that Naming and Necessity is one of the 10 most important, influential books in 20th century philosophy, at least within the so-called analytic tradition. It basically revitalized metaphysics. So there was a time when sort of the idea was metaphysics is a kind of illusion. When we were talking about metaphysics, we're usually just kind of confused. Philosophy is really just about how we use language. And Kripke's book is the main reason that is no longer what most people think. It also revitalized essentialism about properties. So it revitalized the idea that objects have essential properties and they have accidental properties, right? The essential properties are the properties that if that object didn't have that property, it would no longer be that object. As opposed to accidental properties, which are properties that if some object were to not have that accidental property, it would still be that property, right? So that's a kind of classic idea about how properties work and how the identity of objects work. It was sort of out of fashion, and Kripke's book really brought it back to being kind of the orthodox view in metaphysics. So let me dive into the book. Actually, let me just say a quick thing about its history. It was published in 1980, but it's just a transcript of 3 lectures that were delivered in 1970. So even though the book only came out in 1980, people had heard about these lectures and had heard the ideas following when the lectures were delivered in 1970. So the book started to give its influence to the field starting from 1970 on, even though it wasn't published until 1980. So the book basically starts with the question, what is a name? And it goes over some historical answers that have been given to that question. And the first one that it covers is a view by John Stuart Mill, which had fallen out of fashion for a long time. And in a way, Kripke is trying to bring back the Mill view, although his own version of it. So the John Stuart Mill view of what a name is names have no meaning. All they do is refer to the object that they name. So they're really just things that stand for something. That's all that they do. Might seem plausible at first, but it has some obvious problems. The most broad problem that it has is just a question of how is it that names actually do this, right? How does a name manage to to kind of speak metaphorically here, find the thing that it's supposed to be referencing or that it's supposed to be standing for. So let's say that let's take the name Biggie Smalls. Okay, so Biggie Smalls stands in for some person, Biggie Smalls. So the question is, how does it actually do that, right? How does it identify Biggie Smalls in order to be able to refer to him? Well, one way obviously is that if somebody is next to Biggie Smalls, somebody can say, hey, look, it's Biggie Smalls, and point, right? But if you're not there next to him and you can't point, how do you in fact do this? There's another problem with the mill view, and it's the problem about identity statements. So again, the mill view being that all that a name does is stand in for the object that it refers to. So if that's the case, the question then is, why are some identity statements informative? So to kind of continue with the Biggie Smalls example, let's say that I tell you Chris Wallace is Biggie Smalls. That is at least potentially informative, right? Like somebody could not know that and find out and be like, oh, wow, Chris Wallace is Biggie Smalls. So let's say, for example, that Biggie had a childhood friend. Before he ever became a rapper, he had a childhood friend. They were good friends. Then they fall out of touch. The friend doesn't get into hip hop, doesn't follow it, has no further connection with Biggie, and just vaguely hears that there's this rapper who's popular named Biggie. And then one day he's talking to somebody and the person says, hey, remember our friend Chris, how crazy it is that he became Biggie Smalls, right? This person is like, wow, I had no idea. That's amazing, right? However, if on the other hand, the person had said, hey, did you know that Biggie Smalls is Biggie Smalls? The person would say, okay, you haven't, why, what? Of course, you haven't told me anything, right? So the idea is, if all that a name does is simply point to the object, how can Chris Wallace is Biggie Smalls be more informative than simply saying Biggie Smalls is Biggie Smalls, than simply just saying that something is identical to itself? So in trying to solve this problem, a new theory of what names are was proposed, and this is roughly the Bertrand Russell view of how names work. It's also a view held by Frege and some other important philosophers of language. And the view, and this is that actually what names are is not just a thing that just stands in for something. A name is short for a definite description. So the idea is there's this description of something that will uniquely pick it out. In other words, whatever it is that we're describing, the description is going to be specific enough that the thing we're describing is the only thing that satisfies that description. Okay? So a name is actually just short for a description like that. So let's say that the name Chris Wallace actually means a man born on May 21st, 1972 in Brooklyn, New York, to Violetta Wallace and Selwyn Latour. And let's say that the name Biggie Smalls actually means the creator of Ready to Die and leader of Junior Mafia. If that's the case, right, then being told Biggie Smalls is Chris Wallace, right, is not a vacuous statement. It actually is telling us, hey, the thing that satisfies the definite description about a man born in Brooklyn, all those details, and the person that satisfies the description about creator of Ready to Die and leader of Junior Mafia, they're the same person, right? So we're actually being told something substantial when we're told Biggie Smalls is Chris Wallace, in a way that if I told you Biggie Smalls is Biggie Smalls, there's no information there because we're just saying that that definite description is identical to itself. And that is, that seems right. Like that is points for this definite description theory. There are problems with this Frege-Russell definite description view, and a lot of Kripke's book is actually identifying these problems. One problem is that there are actually many possible definite descriptions that could pick out any given object, right? So I could have continued to add details about Biggie's life to either of those two definite descriptions. And I could have done so indefinitely, which means that, and I would have continued to be specifically picking out Biggie, right? So there's really an infinite number of possible definite descriptions for any given object that's being named. So the idea is, why should one name mean one given definite description versus another, right? So let's say that I come up to someone and I say, hey, who's Biggie? And they're like, you don't know? And I'm like, no, I don't. Who's Biggie? Well, they might give me any variation of details that would uniquely pick out Biggie. But to say that any one of those is what the name Biggie means seems kind of implausible. And in fact, when anybody uses the name Biggie, they're probably not actually thinking of any of those descriptions, though they might have to kind of reach for them if asked that question, hey, who's Biggie? Another problem is that the definite description view leaves certain statements trivial that shouldn't be trivial. So let's say, for example, that we're going to go with the meaning of Biggie, that is, creator of Ready to Die. So if I tell you Biggie Smalls created Ready to Die, really what I'm telling you according to this view is the creator of Ready to Die created Ready to Die, right? Totally trivial, no information there, even though the statement Biggie Smalls created Ready to Die does seem like it should be transmitting actual information. Look at it a different way. Let's say that it turns out that Biggie was a fake, right? Somebody else created Ready to Die and he took the credit for it. Okay, if I wanted to say that, I would say, hey, Biggie Smalls did not create Ready to Die. You could actually, according to the definite description view, if what Biggie Smalls means is the creator of Ready to Die, you could analyze that as saying Biggie Smalls is not Biggie Smalls, right? And that's ridiculous, right? It's perfectly possible that Biggie Smalls did not create Ready to Die, where it's not possible that Biggie Smalls was not Biggie Smalls. So the fundamental problem here is that the Frege-Russell view is making the identity of something or someone be predicated on some particular property, right? And for any given property that corresponds to one of these definite descriptions, it's usually the case that actually the object or person in question could not have had that property, or it could have been the case that description did not apply to that person, and still that person or that object would have still been that person or that object, right? And that is inconsistent with this Frege-Russell view. Some people have tried to deal with this problem by creating a theory of identity or of names where names are short not for one definite description, but for a cluster of definite descriptions. Okay? And in order for the name to refer, the object needs to satisfy most of those definite descriptions. And of course, what we mean by most is kind of vague, but the idea is roughly that is how names work. Kripke says this is really the same type of solution, and it's going to have the same kinds of problems. It doesn't succeed at avoiding them. So consider, for example, that we say that Biggie Smalls is, and we list all kinds of things, right? So creator of Ready to Die, and leader of Junior Mafia, and guy who befriended Tupac before becoming his enemy, a guy who was murdered at the age of 24, and we add all of these different properties, and the idea is, well, if it turns out that Biggie failed to meet one or two of them, he still would have been Biggie. But actually, says Kripke, Biggie could have died in a car crash at the age of 1, and actually none of these would have fit. He still would have been Biggie. So Kripke tries to solve all of these problems by proposing his own view, which is a view that kind of harkens back to the Mill view, but makes some significant and important changes. So the main idea in Kripke's theory of naming is that names are rigid designators. Okay, so rigid designators are exactly what they sound like, right? They're a term that designates some given object, and it does so rigidly, which is to say, once it's got it, it holds on no matter what happens, okay? To put that a little bit more formally, what it means is that a rigid designator will refer to whatever object it designates in all possible worlds. So let me explain this idea of a possible world. A possible world is really just a way things might have turned out. Right? You can think of it almost like an alternate history of the world, right? If at some point in time things had gone a little bit differently, right? There's some way that the world might have turned out. Okay? So if the world turned out in such a way that Biggie died in a car crash at the age of 1, right? Things would have turned out very differently, right? But the name Biggie rigidly designates Biggie and does so no matter which of those possible worlds we're talking about, no matter what may have turned out to have happened in his life. Everything could have gone differently. Nonetheless, the name is still going to hold on to Biggie himself. So I should say something about names here, because names could get the idea of names in possible worlds could get a little bit confusing. So the idea is a rigid designator is something that we use in the actual world to rigidly designate objects, no matter what kind of possible situation we're talking about those objects being in. Okay? So, in a world in which Biggie's born, never becomes Biggie, also is never given the name Chris. Instead, he's given the name Troy. Okay? In such a world, he's still Biggie, in the sense that from the world in which we're speaking, right, we use the rigid designator Biggie to talk about that person. So whatever may have happened, including him having a different name, from this world, when we talk about him, we are going to use the rigid designator assigned to him in this world, that is Biggie or Chris Wallace. Both will work. The obvious question at this point should be, why is this not subject to the same problems that Mill's view is? Well, really it is, until we add the sort of extra points that Kripke makes about it. So regarding the broad problem of affecting Mill's view, which is exactly how is it that names pick out objects, right, now that we don't have definite descriptions to do so. For that, Kripke introduces this idea of the initial baptism. Okay, so the initial baptism is when something is first given its name. Okay, so something can be given a name in two ways. One is by essentially by pointing, right? It's like if you are with the object and that object doesn't have a name yet, you can point at it and say, that is Chris Wallace. And now that person has the name Chris Wallace, and that's their name. Okay? Or as we imagine may have happened, right? You can say, I am, I guess Biggie at some point must have said, I am Biggie Smalls. I hereby declare myself Biggie Smalls. The other way is through definite description. So a definite description can be used to pick out the object when we're first naming it. Okay? So Biggie's mom could conceivably have said, the baby that I gave birth to today and who's in whatever hospital was born to me, and Selwyn, I hereby name Chris Wallace. And so, assuming that the description she gave uniquely picked out Chris Wallace, the baby, that was the baby's name. Now forever, that's the baby's name. And the idea is, if a definite description is used to name the person or object, that name is now going to stick no matter what may happen or what may change or what other properties we may find out about the object, or no matter what any of that is, right? Then all that the description was there for was to pick out the object. Now, even if the description actually ended up being kind of erroneous, right? Irrelevant. The idea is the point of the description was actually just to pick out the object. And now the object, when it did that, that object got that name, and now that's the name of that object no matter what. And so, consider, for example, the situation, right? So Chris Wallace is born, and he's swapped out for another baby for some nefarious purposes. He's taken away, some other baby is put in place, nobody notices, and everybody goes calling this new baby Chris Wallace, whereas the original Chris Wallace that was swapped out is given to a different family and given the name Troy Barnes. Well, according to Kripke's view, in fact, all of the things that happen to the person that people call Troy Barnes are actually happening to Chris Wallace, right? So Chris Wallace, by the name Troy Barnes, thinking of himself as being called Troy Barnes, nobody in the world thinks of him as being called Chris Wallace. He goes about his life. He does cybersecurity for the CIA, whatever it is that he ends up doing. All of those things are actually things that Chris Wallace is doing because Chris Wallace was the name that was given to him and now and so rigidly designates him regardless of whatever else may end up happening. Whereas whatever happens to the person that people call Chris Wallace, it actually is happening to whatever the name assigned to that baby initially was. And so then, this initial baptism explains how the name initially comes to be. And then the idea is that the name gets passed on from person to person. Okay, so I hear somebody talk about Biggie Smalls, and now I know who Biggie Smalls is, and then I talk to somebody else about Biggie Smalls, and now they know who Biggie Smalls is. And so there's this chain, a causal chain, that for any given person using a name, you can follow the chain all the way back to the initial baptism. Okay, so how does a name succeed at referring? It does so by following the causal chain of, where did you find out about that name, and where did that person find out about the name, and where did that person find out about that name, all the way down to the initial baptism. The thing being named at the initial baptism is the thing that the name refers to. That is the way that names are able to hone in on the thing they refer to. And regarding the other problem plaguing the Millview, the problem of why is Chris Wallace is Biggie Smalls informative, or any statement of that form informative, the answer is statements like that are informative because they're telling you of these two names for both of them. If you follow that causal chain back to their initial baptism, they point at the same person, right? Whereas a vacuous statement like Biggie Smalls is Biggie Smalls, we already know from the script, from the way that Kripke's theories work, we already know that they're going to lead back to the same baptism because they're their same name, and so it's a vacuous statement. So that's roughly the basics of Kripke's view and why he holds it. There's a couple of really interesting things that should be pointed out, however. One of the coolest things about naming a necessity is that it clarified the distinction between two concepts that had previously been more or less considered roughly identical. And these are the concepts of being a priori as versus a posteriori, and being necessary as versus contingent. Something is a priori if we can know it without having to go to experience, without having to go to the actual world. So, for example, 2 plus 3 equals 5. I don't need any experience. I don't need to go do any kind of investigation in order to know that 2 plus 3 equals 5. So it's a priori, okay? As opposed to water is blue. I'm going to actually need to go take a look at some water, go investigate the world in order to find out that water is blue. So water is blue is a posteriori. And then there's the concept of necessary and contingent. So something is necessary if it has to be that way. Again, a stricter way of looking at that is something is necessary if it has to be that way in every possible world. No matter how things might have turned out, in every possible world, things would have to be that way. So 2 plus 3 equals 5 is necessary. There is no possible world, there's no way things might have turned out where 2 plus 3 did not equal 5. Even if 2 and 3 and 5 had different names, even if there were different languages, the actual concepts would have to hold. 2 plus 3 would have to equal 5. However it is that people name those concepts in those other worlds we're talking about. On the other hand, Biggie created Ready to Die, contingent. Things might have turned out differently. Again, he might have died in the car crash at the age of 1, etc. To explain why Kripke kind of was able to distinguish these ideas, because the idea usually was, yeah, a priori and necessary are distinct concepts, but really anything that's necessary, we're going to be able to know a priori, at least in principle. And anything that's a priori is necessary. That's why we're going to be able to find it out without investigating the world, right? So the idea was, yeah, I guess formally there's some difference in the meaning of the two terms, but actually all things that are a priori are going to be necessary, all things that are necessary are going to be a priori, and so the terms were used more or less indistinguishably. And Kripke shows that actually that's not really true. There are going to be cases where one thing might be one of those but not the other. So give the example of water is H2O. So water is H2O, you might think is going to be contingent and a posteriori. Okay, so a posteriori because we needed to get experience to find out that water is H2O. At some point we didn't know that water was H2O, then we had to actually do science and investigate and look at the world in order to find out, oh hey, water is H2O. And we might think also contingent. We might have never discovered that. Right? It's possible. There's possible worlds in which a meteor hit the planet before we ever found out that water is H2O. But actually, that last claim is wrong, because necessary and contingent are not epistemic ideas, they're metaphysical ideas. They have nothing to do with what we find out or don't find out. They're about what things actually are. And if we remember the insight about rigid designators, then we'll see that if water and H2O are rigid designators, then the thing that they designate is water. Whatever we call it, whatever we know about it, that is the thing that they designate. Again, whatever we call it or whatever we know about it, that thing has to be equal to itself. And so the statement water is H2O, all it's saying is that whatever water actually is identical to itself, right? So in any world where the law of identity holds, which we think is every possible world, right, that is going to be true. Okay, so water is H2O is actually, yes, it is a posteriori. We had to do some investigating to find out, but it is a necessary fact. It could not have been that water is not H2O. That would be like saying water was not self-identical. So this is actually going to be true of all identity statements. All identity statements of the form water is H2O or Chris Wallace is Biggie Smalls are going to be at least necessary. It may turn out that they're also a posteriori, but they're going to definitely be necessary, and in many cases will also be a posteriori. Another case that Kripke gives is the meter stick in Paris. So I've heard about this stick a few times. I don't really know the facts about when this happened, but apparently it's true that a meter is defined as the length of this stick that's hanging out in Paris. The idea is, what's the status of the claim that that stick is a meter long? Is it a priori? Is it a posteriori? Is it necessary? Is it contingent? So let's call the stick S, so I don't have to keep awkwardly saying that stick in Paris. And that's also in order to avoid any issues about, the environment can change the length of the stick based on temperature and air pressure and whatever. Let's just say that actually the definition of a meter is the length of stick S at some given time t. Okay, whatever the length of the stick was at that exact time, that's what a meter is. So the statement stick S at time t was a meter long. What is its status? So you might think, well, a priori and necessary, of course, right? But again, if you take Kripke's insights about rigid designators seriously, then actually you're going to see that it's not necessary, because the definite description saying a meter is the length of this stick at this time was one of these initial baptisms that gave us what meter refers to, and it refers to some given length, right? So the rigid designator meter grabbed onto that length, and now it is that length that the rigid designator designates, right? So no matter what else may turn out to be or may have turned out to be about that stick, it is that exact length that the meter designates. So if it turned out that in some other possible world, some other way things might have been, the stick was a little bit shorter, well, then the stick would not have been a meter long. A meter, again, using the meter from this world, right? From the world in which we're actually speaking, which is the world from which rigid designators work, right? That stick would be shorter than a meter. Okay? So here we have a case where that is not going to be necessary. However, the fact that the stick S was a meter long at time t in this world, in the actual world, we can know that a priori because that's how the word meter was initially baptized, right? That's how it was given its name. And so the fact that stick S at time t was a meter long is an a priori contingent fact. We can know it without having to actually know anything, without having to investigate, just from knowing the fact that that's how meter was defined. However, it very well could have turned out otherwise. The stick, in fact, could have had a different length than the one that it did. In other words, than the one that we have rigidly designated to be the length that is a meter. There's another interesting example that Kripke alludes to, and I think he spells it out exactly in Naming a Necessity, but more or less what he's thinking is implied, and that is, if you follow his idea, you take it seriously, we can never discover that actually there have been unicorns all along. Why not? Well, the name unicorn was first used at some point. That was the initial baptism, and at that point, it was created to designate a fictional creature, okay, a creature that presumably the person doing the baptism did not think existed. Now, if we, find some fossils and find out actually there have been these creatures and they have all the properties that we thought of unicorns as having, then we would find out that there have been creatures that had all the properties that we thought of unicorns as having, but were not actually unicorns, because that's not what we were referring to when we first assigned the name unicorn a referent, right? So we can find out that there are things that are a lot like what we thought unicorns were, but would not actually be unicorns. So Kripke says. Kripke finishes the book off with a fairly major assertion. So it might sound like at this point all this stuff about names maybe doesn't make much of a difference, but Kripke says actually from this some important things are going to follow, including some he thinks his theory about naming shows that the idea that mental states are identical to brain states is definitely false. So here's an idea. Pain just is the stimulation of some C fibers. So, Kripke says, identity statements are necessary, according to his theory, right? In all possible worlds, Chris Wallace is Biggie Smalls. In all possible worlds, water is H2O. And so, if in fact pain is the stimulation of C fibers, then in all possible worlds, pain is the stimulation of C fibers. However, he says, that's absurd. We can easily imagine that there may be worlds where people experience pain, and yet the physical makeup of these people are such that it's not the stimulation of C fibers that causes the pain, it's something else. Therefore, that pain is the stimulation of C fibers is contingent, therefore it is not actually an identity. Those two things cannot be identical, therefore mental states cannot be identical to brain states. I'm going to come back to this idea because I actually think that this argument doesn't quite work. And before getting to that, now I want to get to what I think are some of the problems with Kripke's whole theory. So at this point, I've given you pretty much the whole thing of Kripke's theory of names. So let me now give you what I think are some of the problems with it. The first problem is identified by a philosopher named Gareth Evans. He wrote a really influential paper called The Causal Theory of Names. The paper is from 1973. Gareth Evans says that Kripke treats this initial baptism in a kind of magical way, right? Like Kripke is acting as if the act of the initial baptism is doing something kind of magical. So he gives a couple of examples. Think back to the baby swap scenario, right? So in the baby swap scenario that I mentioned about Chris Wallace, there's a baby given the name Chris Wallace, swapped out for a different baby, absolutely nobody notices, and the new baby, everybody calls Chris Wallace. Anybody who meets him, he thinks of himself as being called Chris Wallace. According to Kripke, not Chris Wallace. What Gareth Evans says is essentially, that's just not how we actually use names, right? That's not how the process of names actually works. Names do involve our association, and sometimes our associations will not correspond to the initial baptism. So he gives a really good example. So I walk into a bar, I get kind of drunk, I see some people that I sort of know, I go and I talk to them, and they're all talking about some guy named Louis. And I'm drunk, I'm pretending to understand, but I don't really understand. And I go home, I talk to my wife, and I kind of came away with the impression that this Louis guy was a basketball player. So I told her, yeah, I was talking to some friends. They were telling me about this Louis guy, great basketball player. In fact, I misunderstood the entire scenario. My friends were talking about Louis XIII, King of France. According to Kripke's theory, when I talk to my wife and I say they were talking about Louis, basketball player, I'm actually talking about Louis XIII, because you can follow the causal chain of my use of Louis from the people I got it from the people they got it from, and you can follow that chain all the way down to the naming of Louis XIII. However, it seems fairly obvious that that's not what's going on. I am not talking about Louis XIII. I think I'm talking about some basketball player that doesn't actually exist. So actually, I'm just failing to refer. That would seem to be the intuitive interpretation of what's happening when I talk to my wife and I say, these guys were talking about Louis, a basketball player. But if you follow Kripke's view, it's going to follow that actually, no, I was referring to Louis XIII without even knowing it. So again, this example is a really good example to show why we've got to keep associations in mind. Another reason that associations are going to have something to do with this kind of goes back to the theory of how identity and names work that I gave in the very first episode. So the idea is, Kripke's whole theory presupposes that there is some identity to some given object, right? So all this time I've been saying that the way rigid designators work is that they grab onto the object that they're designating, and then they hold on to it no matter what properties may be different about it, no matter what may change about it, right? No matter what possible world we may be in. However, that presupposes that there is such a thing as this distinct object, that if, that would survive all of these things being different. Okay, so let's consider, for example, the possible world where Biggie Smalls is a frog. Obviously, that world is actually a world in which Biggie Smalls is not Biggie Smalls. Biggie Smalls is definitely not a frog, right? It could be that Biggie Smalls was born and then died in a car crash before the age of 1. It can't be that he was a frog. Then he just wouldn't be Biggie Smalls. And Kripke acknowledges this, right? However, this just goes to show that Kripke's view presupposes that there are essential properties and accidental properties, right? And so Kripke's view is going to make sense only if the thing that the rigid designator holds on to can survive accidental property changes, but can't survive essential property changes. That's the basic idea. And Kripke is fairly aware of this and more or less states it in the book. So you might ask, okay, what are the essential properties? What is it that actually constitutes a thing's identity? Kripke seems to be assuming the answer to this, and he only really gives it to you straight in a footnote, in a fairly famous footnote in the book towards the end. And in this footnote, he basically makes the claim that it is the substance that the object is originally made from that constitutes its identity. So, got a playing card, right? According to Kripke, if there was a possible world where everything looked exactly like it looks right now to me, and I was holding a card that looks just like this, but I was actually made of something else, managed to feel the same, but actually the physical, the chemical substance that made it up was a different one, then it would not be this card. Whereas if we had the same physical substance, but maybe there was a little, I'm not going to break the card, but there was a little cut in it or something, you might say, okay, yeah, that's the same object, it's just with a different property, right? So the little break would be an accidental property, whereas the substance from which it was actually made is the main essential property. He also notes that that's not going to be the only essential property, right? So if we took the same physical substance of origin, but it was arranged such that this was not a playing card, but a little box, then obviously it wouldn't be this object, right? So not only the substance, but also the form are going to be essential properties. Now, my main criticism of the whole book is that Kripke really just asserts this and doesn't so much make a claim for it as much as just repeats quite a few times that if this were made of something else, then it wouldn't be this, right? But that's actually the thing under question. So just to say that is just kind of trying to teach us how to use identity statements, but without actually making a case for why they should be used the way he wants us to use them. An obvious problem, and he acknowledges this problem, but I don't think he acknowledges its gravity, is that there's significant vagueness in the things that he wants to call the essential properties. So this playing card that I'm holding, if it was made of the same kind of substance, in other words, same chemical makeup, but the actual individual molecules making it up were actually different ones. They were distinct ones. They just happened to be of the same type of substance, and then they came together to make this playing card. Would this be the same playing card? It seems like Kripke isn't entirely clear about what his answer to that question is, but it seems like the intuition behind his assumption is that the identity of the constituent parts of the object in question is what's going to give us the identity of the composite object, right? And so if the identity of all the individual molecules or all the individual atoms that make up the playing card are different ones, it seems like, following his intuition, we should think that this actually would be a different playing card, right? But aside from already being kind of possibly counterintuitive, that's going to get into an obvious vagueness problem that's going to make it very counterintuitive, right? So if we had this playing card with made up of all the same molecules that it currently is made up of, except one molecule is different, would we want to say it's the same playing card? I think that very obviously we would want to say that. I think that Kripke would want to say that. And so you're going to get into a vagueness problem there. And again, Kripke acknowledges that there's a vagueness problem, but I don't think he gives it the weight that it deserves here. The vagueness also is going to enter when it comes to form, right? So I mentioned that he says that form is an essential property, but obviously only at certain levels, right? So again, he would acknowledge that if I broke it a little bit, the form of it would change a bit, but it would still be the same playing card. But if it was, an Uno card, then it would not be the same playing card, okay? So it needs to be not exactly the same form as in arranged in exactly the same way, but the same kind of form, okay? And so these kinds of forms is, again, you're going to get into some kind of vagueness as to, okay, when is a form going to be general enough that an object needs to satisfy that form in order to be that object, right? Actually, Kripke himself puts it very nicely when he says that whether a property is an essential property, that question is going to be vague about objects. I just don't think that he gives that enough weight. The reason I don't think he considers it as much as he should is that this vagueness problem is a symptom of something that I think is really important to consider here, which is that the world does not come neatly prepackaged into distinct objects, right? The distinctness of everyday objects is at least in large part something that is a function of the linguistic process of naming things, of delineating things, and sort of demarcating the lines of identity by the process of identifying things as what they are. In other words, that process of naming. Now, that's not a totally arbitrary process. And again, I talk about this in that first episode, but that process of delineating objects is not a totally arbitrary one. It's given to us in part by how things actually are, and then in part by pragmatic concerns that are fundamental to who we are as humans, and given to us, I assume, by the evolutionary process. But they are partially linguistic. They are partially projected, right? The world itself does not come already with neat borders around things that we can then take as given objects pre-linguistically. Okay? All of which is to say that I, for that reason, think that any kind of theory of identity, which even though Kripke starts by really just talking about naming, it has to come down to a theory about identities. Any kind of theory about identity needs to take into account the fact that associations and linguistic practices has to be a part of that. Not the whole picture, of course, but it does need to be a part of that. And I don't think he gives that enough credence. Let me wrap up by going back to his whole argument about pain and C fibers. So I think what's going on there is that if you follow Kripke's theory down to the letter, then it is possible that pain is just stimulation of C fibers. And in some possible world where pain is caused by something else, actually is a possible world in which this something else is identified with something very much like pain, but not pain, right? So again, according to Kripke's own theory, pain rigidly designates some phenomenon, and then if it turns out that phenomenon is identical with the stimulation of C fibers, then that's going to be true in every possible world. So if there's a possible world where people feel something exactly like pain, but physically what's going on is different, then that's a world where what they're experiencing is not pain, but something else that's just very much like pain. Just like if we discovered unicorns, they wouldn't be unicorns, they would be just something exactly like what we thought unicorns were supposed to be like. And so I actually think that his argument about pain and C fibers, the reason it's wrong actually shows the limitations of his theory. The limitations of his theory is that he wants to kind of identify things via their physical origin and then divorce that entirely from associations that we have about what those things have to be, in a way that ends up ignoring entirely our actual use of names. And that concludes today's episode of Who Shapes the Barber? Next week, I'll speak to Professor Graham Priest of the CUNY Graduate Center about problems of unity and infinite regress. Specifically, we'll discuss Bradley's regress and the unity of the proposition. Again, I'm William Nava. You can check out other episodes, as well as my other philosophical and artistic work at williamnava.com. And if you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, go to williamnava.podbean.com. Thank you so much for listening.